So welcome back. For those of you that I didn't get to meet earlier this morning, I'm Liz Kemery, Director of Communications at PFMA. And I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker for this afternoon, James Emmett. He is the founder of James Emmett and Company, which provides major companies with disability inclusion services. James Emmett and Company is a valued PFMA member. The James Emmett brand is one of the most recognizable in the field of disability inclusion, helping businesses to create long-term strategies, systems, processes, and tools that support a disability inclusive work atmosphere. They help you build a better business through customizable disability solutions and valuable community partnerships. As a leader and expert in the field, James has worked on many of the most visible disability inclusion initiatives with companies like Walgreens, Best Buy, Office Depot, Office Max, PepsiCo, and Mercy Health. He has helped to plan and execute initiatives that have led to more than 80,000 jobs for people with disabilities. The work of James Emmett and Company has achieved numerous awards for innovation related to company-owned disability inclusion. James focuses on transforming the business and disability communities by helping hundreds of companies create disability inclusion brands. Thank you, James, for being here to discuss this important topic today. And before I toss it his way, I just want to remind people we're happy to take questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks for having me. So today we're going to talk about, as mentioned, we're going to talk about two things. We're going to take the first half and really talk about best practice for you all as companies in terms of disability inclusion and what could be if you think about putting strategic intention around hiring people with disabilities. And maybe some of you already have and have learned some lessons, and we'll kind of go through some of that. And then we're going to spend the last part just kind of from a compliance standpoint, making sure one of the things we wanted to do is making sure that each company on here walked away with the understanding of two things. Number one, just a general understanding of the Americans with Disabilities Act and how to follow up. And then we'll quickly go through, if you are a company who's a federal contractor, making sure that you are aware of the Section 503 regulations as it relates to you as a federal contractor and hiring people with disabilities. So first section, we'll talk about business case and best practice. Second section, we will talk more about compliance and some of the legislative issues. Okay. So as was said, my name is James Emmett. I own a family-owned company called James Emmett and Company. We are growing every day. We are fortunate to work across the country. We spend a lot of time in Pennsylvania. A lot of our companies are either headquartered or based in Pennsylvania, but we spend time also across the country in a variety of different areas, but we tend to specialize in three major areas in industries: manufacturing, distribution, and food production. And that really is where our experience has lended, in my personal experience as a disability inclusion consultant. These are some of the major brands that we've had the good fortune of helping to launch their disability inclusion efforts. And most of these brands on here, when we worked with them, did not have any strategic intention around hiring people with disabilities. They did not have a disability initiative. Disability was not included into their diversity and inclusion. And so we help these companies, as a sample, really work towards making sure that people with disabilities, from both a labor and a customer standpoint, were included in everything, in every way that company did business. And we'll talk about some of the outcomes that we found. There's a box that summarizes, but we're going to get more into the business case of hiring people with disabilities. So here's the statistic that that highlights kind of the power, if you will, of the disability community. And if your company has not yet kind of paid attention to strategically bringing people with disabilities in, it's one of the things that in terms of thinking about. So this chart shows that about 20% of the United States population, about 56 million people, have disabilities. And actually, just very recently, the CDC came out with new numbers that said actual Americans, 25% of the country, have some type, 2 out of 5 individuals have some type of disability, whether it's diagnosed or undiagnosed. So it's a big part of our country, right? I'm a person with a physical disability. I was born without my left hand, but we are a big part of the country. We make up 1 in. I think I just got, sorry, I apologize. I think I just got kicked out.
Back on.
Sorry, yep. Somehow I got kicked out. Yep, all right, I'm back. Am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So, sorry for that. So as we look at the country, right, 1 in 4 Americans have a disability. And one of the things that I think is this graph represents that's really important to take into consideration is, for so long, people with disabilities have been left out of what we would call the traditional diversity and inclusion conversation, right? And especially nowadays, diversity and inclusion, such key terminology. But when you look at the statistics of the different focus of diversity and inclusion, which is typically minority, ethnicity, gender, sometimes sexuality, but veterans and people with disabilities have largely got left out of that conversation as a whole. And again, we represent now 1 in 4, 25% of the country, right? So more and more we're seeing companies integrate people with a milieu, but it's still a growing area. It's still a specific growing piece. Okay. All right. So we're gonna move on. We'll move on to the next slide. Let's see here. Sorry about that. So this slide talks a little bit, again, for those of you who are not as familiar with the disability community. This slide is a breakdown of the 65 million Americans that have a disability and the types of disabilities they have, from cognitive to psychiatric to mobility to hearing and vision. And so that kind of gives you a feel for the types of disabilities. But one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is the 2 boxes, the two statistics in the box below. And really so as I said, I'm a person who was born with this disability. My mom was a nurse during the Vietnam War in 1969. She was a nurse at the Naval Hospital just outside of Chicago, the Great Lakes Naval Hospital. And so she was exposed to all kinds of chemicals, maybe even including Agent Orange, right up to like the hour that she had me. So I was probably born without a hand because of that exposure. So I am a person whose disability you could see, right? If you walked into a room and saw me, you can see it right away. And number 2, a person who was born with their disability. And a lot of times, born with their disability and somebody who has a disability. But I'm actually in the dramatic minority in both those categories. So only 83 disability have acquired that disability along life's journey, right? So only 17% of folks are like me who are born with their disability. So what does that mean for your workforce, for your customer base, right? We are all one situation, one diagnosis, one accident, one result of aging, all those things away from joining our community. And as we see, because of the baby boom generation, because of greater recognition of disabilities like autism and ADHD, our community continues to grow. That 1 in 4 number is probably going to continue and move to 1 in 3 eventually as we move forward. So powerful group, folks already working for you, and a powerful customer base as well. And then I think a really important statistic to know is that over 70% of people who have disabilities that you can't see, right? So they have non-apparent, what we call invisible disabilities, things like autism, things like ADHD, things like learning disabilities, like mental health conditions, right? These are all disabilities that you can't see. And so a couple things. So number 1, if you're a company that has jobs that are more physical and you're thinking to yourself, I'm not sure, somebody with a disability could really perform physical jobs, right? Again, we spend most of our time in manufacturing and distribution and food production in helping people with disabilities find very physical jobs often. And this is typically the group that we tap into, this group of folks with invisible disabilities like ADHD and learning disabilities who love to keep their mind and body busy and who also love jobs that have some core routines. So great labor pool in groups with invisible disabilities. And again, that's just from the entry level position. There's so much talent in our world. Leaders, right? More and more, you're seeing more leaders, CEOs of companies who have dyslexia and other disabilities, right? But over 70%. The other thing that means in terms of invisible disabilities is you as a company leader or a company owner already have people with disabilities working for you, right? If you have over 10, right? There's a new article that says, because we're still underrepresented in the workforce, but if the Vegas over-underline of the number of people with disabilities you already have in your company is 10%, right? So if you have a workforce of 200 people, the bet is that 20 of those individuals that are working for you currently have a disability. So even, as you think about hiring more people externally, people with disabilities are already there. And by creating a more disability-friendly culture, you're going to see people with disabilities come forward and want to be leaders in both that initiative, but in the company overall. Okay. So the business case, what is the business case for hiring people with disabilities, right? And one of the things I want you to walk away for the folks who are, again, relatively new to the disability community especially, is that disability employment and disability inclusion, and when we define disability inclusion, again, we mean company-owned disability strategy, big companies and small companies. What we want folks to understand is this is not about charity, right? This is not about one-offs. And in truth, that's what disability employment used to be. But then in 2004 came a gentleman named Randy Lewis. And Randy Lewis was at that time the head of distribution, the distribution division for Walgreens. And Randy has a son with autism. And it was Randy's vision to really think about employing people with disabilities at scale and showing corporate America that this isn't about one-off or charity. This is about true and real labor and business strategy. And so I had the pleasure of working under Randy for a couple of years, helping him set up the Disability Inclusion Project within the distribution centers in the Walgreens world. And what ended up happening, and now this statistic shows 1,200, but now they're actually getting closer and closer to tipping 2,000 people with disabilities in the workforce in the distribution center. So almost 20% of Walgreens distribution workforce are people who have disclosed with disabilities. And so a few years ago, the Society for Safety Engineers took a look at the overall initiative and said, is there really business case when you hire people with disabilities at scale? And what they found is in the boxes in front of you. So if you look at the far left, right, the green bars are people with disabilities. The blue bars are people without disabilities. And what they found in terms of productivity across all distribution centers, people with disabilities were either as productive or even maybe a tick more productive. They said higher productivity. We'll call it even productivity. But when you look at the next two boxes, this is where Walgreens and so many companies are seeing the return on investment. All close to 50% reduction in turnover from people with disabilities compared to people without. And this is what's being replicated. People with disabilities are a loyal workforce, right? They will, if you go out of your way to recruit and support them, chances are that they're going to stick with you and be an excellent employee for a long time are very high, right? So 50% reduction in turnover, and then a third less reportable workers' comp incidents. And I know a lot of you are in companies where there may be a lot of fast moving equipment or material moving around or different things that cause you concern for safety. But what Walgreens found is that they actually found 33% less reportable workers' comp incidents for people with disabilities compared to those who did not. There's a variety of reasons for that. People often say, well, I could see as safe, but safer, what does that mean? And so what the main reason, a lot of reasons there are out there, but one of the things Walgreens folks will tell you is that people with disabilities tend to reify their training. They're on the job training. They try to follow the rules. They try to build the skills as quickly as possible. And when they go into a safety training, right, they basically try to reify those rules, where maybe their counterpart without a disability is kind of sleeping through the training, and then 6 months later walks through that stop sign in the distribution center and gets hit with a forklift, right? But it's that person with a disability who's continuing to reify those safety rules. So, business case: as productive, much more loyal, reduction in turnover, and better safety record. And that has not just been seen at Walgreens now. That's been seen at Pepsi and Amazon and UPS and many mid-sized manufacturers. We work with a couple food producers who have seen exactly those same results. So what are the things that have been done in the past? When we say disability inclusion, now you're saying, okay, I hear the business case, but what is a disability inclusion project? What if as a company builds strategic intention around disability inclusion, what does that mean? And so these are some of the things that this means. So first and foremost, training. We do diversity training, we do disability awareness training, and that's not just us doing that, but a good initiative. We provide those disability awareness training for leaders. It's important your leaders be able to be provided that perspective by somebody who understands the disability community. Providing human resource mentoring. That's one of the things that a lot of projects have done in the past. Coaching your HR team on how to make interviews, how to make screening, interviews, how to make onboarding a little bit more accessible. So that, as we said, supporting those processes of screening and training. Building job accommodations, but more importantly, a lot of you hear the word job accommodation, and then we're going to talk about that at the back end in just a few minutes, and you think risk or liability, but really, right, if done right, job accommodations can help everybody perform their jobs better. But still, job accommodations are reactive most of the time. We like to use the term natural supports, where we're being proactive in supporting people with disabilities, using things like small visual scripts or job aids that are going to enhance a person's performance. A couple other things that have really benefited from the past. There's a lot of financial incentives out there to hire people with disabilities, right? Tax credits, on-the-job training dollars, a program called Ticket to Work. There's a lot of incentives out there. So it's not only opening a new workforce, there's a lot of ways to definitely cost justify in both financial and staff resources invested in this. And then things like you partnering with the state for on-the-job training or job tryouts, being able to take advantage of job coaching, right? A lot of companies we work with, we help them partner with local nonprofit organizations who sometimes bring what's called the job coach into support workers with disabilities. Now this job coach doesn't take over your supervisor's role or your trainer's role. They just kind of augment the process if the person needs support. And it's, again, great to have, most companies say, great to have a resource to help them through. And then at the end of the day, marketing and PR. Not only, like we said, are people with disabilities a powerful labor base, we're also a powerful customer base. And so here's some of the lessons of companies. Again, if you're considering building more of a disability inclusion strategy, here's the lessons, and we'll provide you'll have the full, I won't go into each one for time's sake, but you'll be provided the full PowerPoint. But a couple things to really highlight. So if your company is new to disability inclusion but wants to take it on, first thing you want to do is find a visible champion, right? Preferably a champion at the C-level suite or that's higher in the company structure, who not only is going to kind of champion the words of this effort, but put resources and put leadership behind that. We have to find kind of that visible champion. But the second thing that I think is just as important, we have found, is that once we find that visible champion, we want to make sure that we help your on-the-ground supervisors, the individual supervisors that are directly supervising people, understand, A, how to support people with disabilities, but B, what's in it for them? Why should they want to more aggressively bring on board people with disabilities, right? What will be in the benefit to your supervisors? Will it be, you know, that loyalty we're talking about? Will it be to have somebody who comes every day and smiles and gives very little attitude? Will it be to have somebody who knows how to overcome barriers, right? Those type of things that really can make a supervisor's job actually more easy. And we hear supervisors report that. Couple other things. Number 6 talks about clear messaging, right? Borrowing from the LGBTQ community. If you're going to do this, one we recommend is don't do it through the back door. Don't bring in people with disabilities quietly. Don't kind of try to sneak them in, right, to your workforce. Train your workforce. Be loud and proud. That's the way you create those inclusive environments. And, you know, in today's world, we understand that there's a lot of talk and focus on race and gender. But as we know, right, a disability is non-discriminatory, meaning, right, disability affects all people of all sexualities, race, gender, age, across the spectrum, right? So we are across that diversity spectrum. And then number 9, thinking about, as the companies who have done this in the past would tell you, make sure you keep that eye on return on investment, right? Making sure that this is a business project. If you go and do this, that it's not charity, that it doesn't turn into just a good story, right? We want to make sure that we keep that eye on the ROI. And then culture. Almost every company that does disability inclusion well, no matter how good their culture was coming in, reports positive cultural impact. And it's not just because people with disabilities often provide that positive attitude, but it's often that the workforce, your current workforce, either through themselves or through a family member or through a friend, they can relate. They know somebody with a disability. And we often have what we call the rally effect. And people, current workforce rallying around people with disabilities, which raises all the morale. So positive culture change, often a part of things. So this kind of just summarizes the reason for you to think about disability inclusion. The reason, if you're the leader of your company, to think about making the leap into disability inclusion, or the reason to be able to take it to your leaders and say, you know, I realize that this is good for business. On the far left, it has high ROI. It's been proven to work in multiple industries, right? This isn't like 2004 when I was back at Walgreens, where we had no track record of any companies doing this. Many companies are diving in. Microsoft, another from a different industry, right? Microsoft at their Seattle office has 5 or 6 full-time disability specialists, right? So many companies diving in headfirst into disability inclusion. It fulfills compliance needs, right? So from both an EEOC and if you're a federal contractor from a 503 perspective, which we'll talk about in just a second, doing this well fulfills that compliance needs. And at the end of the day, why I love doing disability inclusion and why I'm so proud of the work we've done is it does actually bridge good with good for business, doing well, but also positively impacting the bottom line. So as you think about the future, right, in terms of best practice, if you were to take this and think about a more active disability inclusion program within your company, we ask you to think about these 4 pillars. We ask you to think about buy-in of stakeholders, and we've hit on that, right? Your internal stakeholders, your leaders, you're on the ground, but then external stakeholders, right? Being able to relate to the community, talk to the community about what you're doing. Financial sustainability. If you do this, your companies often, you're not often, always, or if it's going to be a business project, either invest staff time, financial resources, or a combination thereof. And that there has to be financial sustainability in the project. It has to generate return on investment. That's one of the things we do as a company is make sure the projects we support have that pillar as a key, because we understand if you're draining money, especially these days in a bad project, that project isn't going to sustain. Messaging and engagement. We, as we said, we strongly suggest that if you're going to approach it, you approach it from a loud and proud perspective, and you engage your stakeholders, both your current workforce, your future workforce, and the community as a whole. And you do that often by building the last pillar, partnerships, right? There are a lot of local, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, local organizations, regional organizations, and national organizations that touch Pennsylvania. And there's a lot of good partners out there to be had. So when just kind of an overview of the services, but more importantly, how we think about strong disability inclusion projects. If you were to build a framework in your company for a disability inclusion project, we think that entitles 5 things. We think that entitles opening up a new source and a new source of employees, a pipeline of candidates. And not just initially, right? Because if you go loud and proud out into the community, chances are you will have a burst of candidates with disabilities interested in coming to you. But it's important to take that burst and capitalize it on, but also continue to partner and build that sustainable pipeline of candidates. That's the sourcing piece. Having available disability awareness training, not just doing one training, but being able to have, built into your learning management systems or to your ongoing training. Creating natural supports, right? On-the-job supports. And again, typically what we see is when we build an on-the-job support for somebody with a disability or somebody with autism, typically that support doesn't just get used by that person, it often gets used by everybody. When we build visual supports for people with invisible disabilities, when we build visual supports to support their visual learning style, it often gets replicated across the facility. Capturing those incentives. I've often heard companies say, well, we want to hire people with disabilities. We want to hire good labor. We want to hire a good labor pool. We hear the loyalty component, and that's so critical, especially nowadays with all the changes. So we don't necessarily need to take advantage of those incentives, but if they're there, right, as a business case, you want to, the tax credits, the on-the-job training dollar, capture those incentives. And then at the end of the day, tell a good story, right? It's okay to tell a good story. It's just not advisable to overpromise or, kind of use it from a, oh, look at us, we're such a great company because we're hiring people with disabilities, but instead telling the story of the success that you've had and tapping into this amazing labor market and being able to put that out there is something that that can really benefit you as a company. So in the end of the day, right, when you think about disability inclusion best practice, this is how the expectations, if you were to build or expand your disability efforts, these are the things that you would expect, right? Increased access to good employees, decreased turnover, decreased training costs, access to those incentives, meeting all your social responsibility goals. And then also more and more companies now who are building disability inclusion are teaching their customers, right, as a good business service, how to do it as well, or being a model for their customers, which just enhances their relationship more with their specific customers. Okay. All right, so now we're going to dive into the second part, right? And with every kind of best practice, with every niche group, related to inclusion also comes the compliance component. So we wanted to make sure as you walked away that you were aware of some of the basic compliance. And some of you may already be aware of these, one or both of these, but we wanted to make sure there was clarity around this. So we're going to talk about 2 things, as we said. Now, first one is the Americans with Disabilities Act and just kind of highlighting the ADA. And then for those of you out there who have either a federal contract or a federal subcontract, we're going to just quickly hit on those 503 regulations. So Americans with Disabilities Act, right? That 30 years. So we're at actually the 30-year anniversary when the first President Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. And those 30 years have had so many changes, so many positive changes, and mostly in the disability community. But what does the ADA do? So it protects people with disabilities from harassment or disparate treatment. It also says that it's important for you as a company to think about providing reasonable accommodations and making sure that you have qualifications and qualification standards that don't systematically screen out people with disabilities. So what's an example of that last one? We recently engaged with a company that had on their job description that to work in a specific set of roles, you had to lift 50 pounds. And then when we did the job analysis just to find out more, we were told that, well, that's really not the case anymore, right? Nobody really has to lift 50 pounds anymore. And if they do, it's a team lift. So what we want to do is take that out of the job description, right? Because that 50-pound restriction is maybe keeping people with some different types of disabilities and maybe some people in general, right? Just away from that role. But we don't want to, right, screen people out on qualification standards that aren't related to those essential job functions. So a qualified individual, and that's really important, right? To remember that the ADA isn't this swooping law that covers everybody with a disability and makes you as a company hire just anybody, right? The ADA does not require things like you hiring candidates that aren't qualified, right? And making sure that that's a clear point, that to be qualified under the ADA, that job seeker must satisfy all the other skills and the necessary skills and qualifications, and they must be able to perform the essential functions of the job, right? So one of the things that when we engage with a company, we make it clear that we understand whether it's a top leadership position or an entry-level position or anywhere in between, that we understand that the jobs require solid skill match, right? And being able to match that skill to somebody with those abilities and the necessary capabilities to do the essential functions. And if a person can't perform the essential functions with or without a reasonable accommodation, they're not covered, right? And the ADA does not cover those folks. So the ADA does not force you to hire unqualified people, and it also allows you to terminate people who aren't living up to documented performance standards. So what is an accommodation, right? Like we said in the beginning, we like really the companies we work with to think about proactivity. How do we support our workers with disabilities, or how do we support our workers in general? But there's also the accommodation, which tends to be a little bit more reactive, but as a company, no matter what your size, right? You're impacted by the ADA. It's important that you're aware of what an accommodation is, and it's important that you have a strong, reasonable accommodation policy and process, meaning that your supervisors, it's not just your HR team that understands how to request an accommodation. Your supervisors understand that process. The people on the floor, you've educated your workforce that if you ever need an accommodation, here's what you would do. But what an ADA accommodation is, right? You never have to eliminate an essential function to provide an accommodation. You never have to lower those production standards, right? And you never have to change rules that are uniformly applied to everybody else, right? Different rules of, workplace violence, workplace performance. You don't have to change any of those rules. And to make an accommodation, the employee you as the employer should engage in the interactive process, right? Point on there, right? The interactive process. If an employee needs help, if they need an accommodation, and they don't have to come to you and say, I need an accommodation, right? They may ask you in different ways. They may ask you for help to perform their functions, or that tell you they're struggling and they need some support. That is still the way to engage in that dialogue with that employee, because it's employee's responsibility to come forward and ask for that help, but it's the employer's responsibility to engage in the interactive process and eventually help determine what accommodation makes sense and is reasonable. All right, so that's kind of just a basic overview of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're going to conclude with the Section 503 overview. And again, some of you, this may not apply to, but many of you who are listening or will listen to this, you are a federal contractor or some contractor. So just a quick overview of the Section 503 rules. So the Section 503 rules have been in the Rehab Act for a very long time, but they were more officially implemented and adopted in 2014 to much more aggressively stop employment discrimination by federal contractors and subcontractors, and then also make sure that there is affirmative action on the part of federal contractors and subcontractors to hire and promote people with disabilities. So what are these 503 regulations if you haven't done yet, if you haven't come in contact with them yet, but if you're a federal contractor or subcontractor, and I encourage you to look into the specific details. So the basic 503 regulations require you as a subcontractor or contractor to make active steps to hiring people with disabilities across your business. And this applies, like we said, this law has been in place since 1973, but really the enforcement has stepped up starting in 2014. And any business that has a federal contract or subcontract over $10,000 should be aspiring to making sure that the ultimate goal is at least 7%. It's sometimes called the 7% rule. 7% of your workforce are people with disabilities. So, and it's important to know that that 7% applies to all your job categories. So how you categorize jobs, for example, it's not acceptable from 503 regulations to just load one of your part-time roles with people with disabilities and don't hire people with disabilities in anywhere else across your company. If you break it down by management, however you break down, or by skill level, or by specific departments, however you break those jobs down, the goal should be to hire 7% in each of those areas, be people with disabilities. And for any company, if you're a company that has $50,000 or more in grants or contracts from the federal government, and you have more than 50 people, you have to maintain an aggressive affirmative action program. Make sure that you report on a regular basis towards your progress towards 7%. And again, you want to be able to do that across categories if you have more than 100 employees. I think the important thing to realize here is that more and more the Department of Labor and more specifically OFCCP, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, is focusing on disability. Craig Lean, who leads OFCCP now, has a very close connection to the disability community, and is having what they call disability focus reviews, where they are going out and anybody who's a contractor or subcontractor may be audited just on the way that they are reaching and doing their disability inclusion work. A couple other things to think about. So self-identification, and this is one of the things that businesses find the hardest, because, right, the Americans with Disabilities Act tells you as an HR or a business leader not to ask if a person has a disability or to ask anything about their disability, right? It's a don't ask, don't tell law. Yet now, right, for those of you who are federal contractors, you're saying, well, if I can't ask and I can't tell, how am I supposed to track towards that 7%? And so the recommendation by the federal government is to build your self-identification program. In other words, if you are a contractor or subcontractor, you are required to ask before the interview, during the interview, and after the interview if the person has a disability. You give them an invitation to self-identify. And the way that works, you could word it differently, but it's providing that opportunity to self-identify. And if you haven't, you're required to initially survey your workforce and then survey your workforce every 3 years. There's a link in the PowerPoint on what survey form can be used in that and what form can be used in that self-identification process. But the opportunity, providing that opportunity for candidates and new employees to self-identify is critical for anybody who is a federal contractor. You also want to be collecting data, right? If you have a subcontract or a federal contract, you want to be collecting data on a variety of different things related to folks with disabilities, because if the Department of Labor ever comes knocking, you want to be able to turn right to your data to determine, to show them the number of people who have self-identified, the number of people who have been promoted, the number of people in the different years that you've interviewed and hired compared to that. So having that data at hand and being able, feeling comfortable to track that data, really important towards compliance. And there's ways to do that. There's different resources to help you do that. And then lastly, the key thing on 503 that more and more the Department of Labor is looking at is your outreach, right? So do you have, as a company, active outreach to the disability community? Do you reach out to American Job Centers, to state, the Pennsylvania Vocational Rehabilitation, they call it OVR, right? The Office of Voc Rehab in Pennsylvania, other employment networks, other disability organizations like Easter Seals, like Goodwill, like the ARC, like the Jewish Federation of Services, right? Those organizations. And then there's a lot of local organizations. Every high school has a special ed department. Every high school district has a special ed department and a school to work transition department. Are you, as a company, reaching out to those to post your job leads and to try to actively recruit people? And then for those of you who recruit for more professional roles, are you working with your local university and colleges, departments of special services, right? Every university, every college has a special service department or a disability department where they support students with disabilities. Are you actively reaching out to those, to that entity on the campuses that you're near and other disability groups that exist within university campuses? So in closing, right, when we think about compliance, whether you are a federal contractor or not, you know that you have to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and you have to stay within the EEOC, the Equal Opportunity Guidelines. If you are a federal contractor or subcontractor, then you add on those 503 requirements. And so from a best practice standpoint, you, not just sometimes I see, especially in small companies, the HR department takes on all this work, right? But it's important to familiarize your managers and supervisors with these laws, and especially with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if an employee does come forward and ask for an accommodation, that supervisor doesn't react in the wrong way or direct them in the wrong. So educating your management team on these regulations, making sure that you don't make general assumptions or blanket exclusions for your applicant base, right? And making sure you try to, especially now in these days of applicant tracking systems and artificial intelligence that often determines which candidates are screened, the more flexible and the more individualized we can make our screening, recruiting, our hiring process, still the better it's going to be for folks with disabilities. To give you an example, some artificial intelligence programs in screening often screen out people from a job because they have gaps in their time gaps in their resume. And for job seekers with disabilities, there may be a really justifiable reason for that time gap. It may be disability related, it may be family related, but there may be a reason for that. But the artificial intelligence is already automatically screening that person out who could have been your best candidate. And then thinking about the concept of reasonable accommodations, and what more and more we use the term, not necessarily accommodation, but it's accessibility, right? And it's universal design for learning, making things accessible from the second you touch a candidate, right? A candidate hears about your company all the way through the promotion process. The more we can try to think about things from an accessibility standpoint and try to knock down the barriers instead of kind of just running and keeping those barriers up, I think the better candidates you're going to find and the more compliant that you will be. All right, and this is in final, my contact information. And again, as far as for me, the walkaway is that disability inclusion is not about charity. It's about best practice in business. It's about opening a loyal labor force, and it's about reducing compliance, because those compliance risks are out there. If you take that on and you build a disability inclusion project, you can turn what you maybe think as lemons right now into kind of that lemonade. So thank you for having me. I'll stop there and open it up to any comments or questions.
Thank you, James. Do we have any questions? I actually have one for you, if you don't mind.
Sure, please.
So my sister-in-law is 80% deaf, and she actually works in higher education, but you know, she manages very well. And when COVID happened, she had a new problem because everybody was wearing masks. So, you know, she does a lot of lip reading, and that was now no longer possible in her classroom. So, I mean, that's just one example, but are there other things that you have seen over the last couple of months that have like enhanced or changed, you know, what people are used to dealing with? They've had new problems pop up because of COVID and the pandemic.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's there is like we partner with Advanced Auto as one of our Liz, and they are aggressive hires of the deaf from the deaf community, and so they have actually started using clear masks in their distribution centers so that their deaf employees can see the lips of everybody as they move forward. They also try to if they can use clear masks, they work on that social distance, but still being able to see lips. But COVID has changed a lot for the disability community, right? In interesting ways. So sometimes it's about making, you know, there's a lot of folks with disabilities who maybe are more at risk, right? So that those precautions of maybe not going into an essential business, some folks with disabilities are considering that more and more, like, I guess, like everybody. But it also has opened in an interesting way. It also has opened up opportunities, right? In the industries that we work with, we're seeing companies that, even though there's such high unemployment rate, have dramatic need for loyal workers, right? That their workers are walking off the job, not showing up, and they can't get their product out the door. And so we are taking that as an opportunity to really say, okay, here's a loyal workforce that can be pre-screened. And we're seeing this as an opportunity. The other thing I think that's really important that most folks from the disability community would say about the COVID and the COVID-19 and the pandemic is, I kind of think like, we kind of think that now the world is seeing what it's like to make accommodations, right? You know, yeah, for your workforce. Maybe it's working at home virtually. Maybe it's, you know, it's that social distancing requirement. Maybe it's taking temperature checks on the in. But these are all quote unquote accommodations, right, that are being made for the workforce. But we're starting to see that the world of employers are starting to think about work differently, and that often is benefiting, because that's what we often preach is different isn't bad. Sometimes different is more productive and good, right? So long answer to your question, great question, but yeah, so we've seen some risk, but we also seen some opportunity during this time.